It's wonderful to have Alexander Booth joining us once again. This is his third time on the show. He is the premier conservative intellectual and I suppose the resident conservative intellectual on this podcast. And today we're discussing and I suppose disputing the legacy of one Henry Kissinger. Welcome to the show, Alexander. It's good to have you.
Yes, I always like to start with the positive. And the positive thing about Henry Kissinger is that he is easily the most brilliant foreign secretary in my lifetime, quite possibly the most brilliant foreign minister in my lifetime of any country. And I would, in terms of his intellectual attainment and intellectual qualifications for the job, I would rank him right up there with those stars of the 1815 Vienna Congress, your Metternichs, your Talleyrands, your Castlereaghs, and all those people. So that's the good bit out of the way. And, you see, unfortunately, brilliance by itself does not a statesman make. It's not intellectual brilliance as opposed to intellectual competence. I wouldn't even rank it exceptionally high on the list of requisite virtues. What's critical is that intellectual attainment be linked to superlative character, which is a much more important quality in the statesman, I think. And that's where I think Henry Kissinger falls short. Now, he's generally regarded as the maestro of realpolitik, of a man who pursued pragmatic policies rather than ideological ones. And in general, pragmatism, words like pragmatism or common sense, have become the buzzwords of political discourse, especially on the right. People keep saying that, we're not ideologues, we're pragmatists, we just look at what works. It sounds good. I mean, all God's children like pragmatism and practicality. But there's the rub. And the rub is that this global interlacing of widely divergent national interests creates such a ganglion of ramifications that even an extremely intelligent man, or even a group of extremely intelligent men, which in today's politics, a very unlikely proposition, can possibly figure out the consequences of every long-term consequences, that is, of every political policy, especially in the area of foreign relations. And therefore, we must talk about the very philosophical justification for pragmatic foreign policy, or pragmatic politics, as opposed to those driven by first principles. To begin with, very often people who insist on first principles are accused of being ideologically driven. That is a confusion of terms in my view, because ideology is a secular faith based on an unrealistic assessment of man, his actions, his thoughts, his character, his nature. Whereas first principle, on the other hand, in Christendom at any rate, are very solidly rooted in the doctrine of original sin, that man is fallible because he's fallen. He's not perfect morally. He is not perfect intellectually. Moreover, it's very doubtful if he's perfectible, which is why the two godfathers, as it were, of modern Western conservatism, Edmund Burke and Joseph de Maistre in France, both insisted on first principles based on, well, first, of course, based on religion, but second, what Burke called presumption on the historical experience. That people have been around for a very long time. Everything that could have been tried has been tried. So we kind of know what works and what doesn't work in general terms. Now, translating general terms into particular terms and into specific policies is very difficult. However, and I'm sorry for about talking in generalities. I'll get to the specifics of Henry Kissinger in just a second, but I want to set my stall, as it were. And in practice, it very often turns out that policies based on first principles turn out to be more practically successful in the long term than those actually that looked extremely practical and pragmatic and commonsensical when they were adopted, but then came a cropper a few years later. And here we come to Henry Kissinger. I think you wrote an article in which you quoted Daniel Patrick Moynihan saying that he, Moynihan, took a lifetime trying to understand what Burke meant, whereas Kissinger had this knowledge in his cradle. In other words, Kissinger is an intuitive conservative. I think it's wrong. I'm not sure that Daniel Patrick Moynihan ever understood what Burke was about, and I'm certain, well, Kissinger could understand absolutely anything, but he certainly wasn't guided in his actions, but by anything that Burke actually taught. What is pragmatism as applied to Kissinger? He eschewed general principles, first principles, ideologies, and whatever, both intellectual and moral, for the sake of immediate practical gain. And he was so good at it that actually one could be forgiven for doubting whether he actually did have any morality or possessed any first principles. But if you look at his great putative triumph and listing them chronologically, it will be SALT I, détente with the Soviet Union, rapprochement with China, the end of the Vietnam War, and negotiating peace between Egypt and Israel in 1973. Only the last one of those can be judged as qualified success, very heavily qualified success, may I add. All the others ended up in well-nigh disasters. For example, SALT I, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty that is signed with the Soviet Union. Now everybody, including Kissinger, knew that the only value to the treaty was purely PR and grandstanding. Everybody knew the Soviets would cheat. Kissinger knew it as well. Nonetheless, he felt that the American public had to have its fears of a nuclear holocaust allayed, and that's what he proceeded to do. That was followed by the policy of détente, which involved massive transfers of capital and technology to the Soviet Union. So as a result of this pragmatic policy resulting in SALT I and then détente, the Soviet Union, using that as the cover, in the 1970s built up its military muscle to a point where it could practically match up to NATO. And that and which probably extended its lifetime, the lifetime of the Soviet regime, by a good decade. It's interesting that Ronald Reagan's administration, which was more likely to proceed from first principles, and he openly talked about the Soviet Union as an evil empire and all that. Now it was that administration that hastened the decline and collapse of the Soviet Union, and Kissinger had no place in it. I mean, neither Reagan nor either Bush president actually offered any job to Kissinger because his brand of pragmatism didn't seem to fit. If you look at China, yes, that's believed to be his tremendous triumph. He went to China in 1971 in secret, had a clandestine meeting with Zhou Enlai, and set up this historic meeting between Nixon and Mao. Again, that involved, among other things, selling Taiwan down the river, because at that time it was Taiwan, the Taiwan that represented China, and it was Taiwan that had a seat on the UN Security Council. Now, one condition that Mao put forth was that situation be abolished. Taiwan was delegated to political wilderness, whereas the People's Republic became the sole representative of China. And that was followed again by a huge transfer, by incorporating China into the world economy, massive transfer of technology, a massive transfer of capital. And what do we have now? A country that was basically semi-feudal, and though it always presented a danger due to its sheer bulk, suddenly became a serious rival of the United States and of the West in the world, economically, militarily, in every which way you dare to mention. So the past three American presidents have desperately tried to do something about it. They introduced some trade limitations, some sanctions, and all that, but it's too little, too late. China has become a global giant. And so that cannot be judged as a success. The end of the Vietnam War. Now, in 1973, Kissinger signed the Paris Accord with his Vietnamese counterpart, Le Duc Ho, and I'm sure I'm mispronouncing the name, Le Duc Ho. How do you pronounce it?
Later talk, but you have to use it with the accents.
All right, but anyway, there was a great pomp about the worldwide jubilation. This horrible war had ended. Peace was finally achieved. Now the easiest way to achieve peace in any war is for one side to surrender. And that's exactly what happened, because Kissinger's diplomacy delivered Vietnam, South Vietnam, to the communists. He knew that would happen. Everybody knew that would happen, and yet the Nobel Committee awarded this peace prize to both participants. Now, Le Duc Ho had the decency to decline it because he knew that was no genuine peace treaty, whereas Kissinger, of course, gobbled it up with alacrity. So Kissinger was never a great hero of mine, I must say. Even though I personally gained rather a lot from his daytime with the Soviet Union, because thanks to that, I ended up in the West and not in the concentration camp. But But I'm a firm believer in first principles. And of course, you could not be dogmatic about it. Of course, it goes without saying that no politician, certainly no diplomat, can possibly insist on never deviating from very stringent, very strong principles. That just can't happen in the real world. But before you decide when, how, and to what extent to deviate from your principles, you must have those principles. You must understand what they are, and you must, in general, be guided by them, with unfortunate deviations, unfortunate exceptions that are unavoidable. With Kissinger, while of course intellectually, I mean, Moynihan was right in the sense that Kissinger, of course, had absolutely no problem understanding Burke's brand of conservatism, which is basically modern conservatism, certainly in the Anglosphere. But he certainly wasn't guided by what he understood about Burke.
No, I think I'd like to focus a bit on the Paris Treaty that supposedly ended the Vietnam War. I understand that January the 27th, which was 2 weeks ago, was the date in 73 that it was signed. That date, yeah, in these times was rather overshadowed by Holocaust Remembrance Day. Now, from my understanding, and certainly Kissinger understood this as well, that there's this principle that America should back its allies, and in this case, it was South Vietnam. But I guess a realpolitik, for lack of a better term, shows that South Vietnam is on its losing streak, and it has been on its losing streak for forever, and its government is especially volatile and unstable. There are at least like two coups d'etats that went on ever since 1963, for example.
Both
And it
both
can,
both of them inspired by the United States. Certainly the coup d'état against Diem and his brother and their subsequent murder, they were engineered by the United States.
yes,
Just as an aside.
of course. Now,
So you
Kissinger was in no way sort of responsible for that. I think that was a legacy of the Kennedy administration.
Yes, exactly. Well, of course, it was it was the Kennedy administration that did that, and you're right that Kissinger was not personally responsible. But you said that the government of South Vietnam was basically unstable. I'm just saying that a great deal of that instability was actually caused by the United States.
Yes.
You know, but yeah, of course, South Vietnam, you can hear the same sort of things now being said about the Ukraine
Mhm.
that used to be said about South Vietnam, that the Ukrainian government is corrupt, that Ukrainian oligarchs basically pilfer untold billions from public funds, that the country isn't perfect, and of course it's not, and of course it's corrupt. And of course, South Vietnam was corrupt. But whoever said that every ally that the United States or the West has should be a compendium of angels with a pair of wings attached to their backs? I mean, of course, South Vietnam wasn't perfect, but let's not forget that that Americans lost 55,000 servicemen there in a war that was regarded to be just. Such wars should either not be started, or if started, it should be won. What America did was very wrong on both counts. And again, that comes from because in a way, whereas the Kennedy administration didn't have the intellectual fiber of Henry Kissinger, you know, emotionally, morally, and temperamentally, they were very close. Because it was also an act of political grandstanding when Americans went into Vietnam, and Kennedy was sort of earning himself some political capital which he had frittered away during the Cuban crisis, of course, and with his inability to overthrow the Castro regime in Cuba, Playa Huron and Bay of Pigs, all that sort of thing. But once started, that war should have been won. And that and Kissinger, of course, who at that time, incidentally, he is very often referred to as a diplomat, which is demoting the man to a lower status than he actually had, because a diplomat merely communicates his government's foreign policy. Kissinger, to a very large extent, formulated it, bypassing the State Department routinely and sort of playing fast and loose with a few conventions, some of them of the constitutional nature. But so yes, of course, whatever you say about South Vietnam can also be said about the Ukraine. Of course, it's corrupt, but the West had a vested interest in winning the war in Vietnam, or not in not starting it to begin with, but once started winning it, as it now has a vested interest in the Ukraine's victory against what is very clearly a fascist regime. So, unfortunately, politics, especially pragmatic politics, is very often the art of choosing the lesser evil, or the evil of two lessers, as I would say. There's no question that communism in China, Vietnam, Korea, Cambodia, presented a much greater threat than any kind of corruption and any kind of instability in South Vietnam or South Korea or Thailand or any of those countries. But communism is the ultimate evil of the 20th century and 21st century. It had to be stopped. I'm speaking from first principles here. And I think that the application of this particular first principle would have produced better results than pragmatism. Kissinger at first he expanded in Vietnam. He thought that he could strike this final chord, the thunderous final chord, and then leave on his terms. Well, the chord he did strike, but he didn't leave on his terms. He left. You see, that's again, the word pragmatism describes a very good thing to have. But the problem is to know what constitutes pragmatism at this particular juncture. And that is the difficult part. And one man's mind, no matter how brilliant, is insufficient to that task, which is what Temester wrote, for example. If you read his Considérations sur France, sur la France, he specifically talks about it, that the politics is such a complicated matter that the experience of one lifetime is insufficient to understanding it properly. So the best thing you can do is be guided by what Burke called prejudice, presumption. Prejudice, by the way, these days is a word that has acquired exclusively negative connotations, but prejudice basically means a priori judgment. It means first principles, really. And if you don't have that, then your thought isn't anchored anywhere, and it's cast adrift, and it floats off to unknown destinations, and God only knows where it will end.
Now, in regards to his rapprochements and I guess reaching out to the two premier communist regimes at the time, the Soviet Union and China, I think that it's something that I think I wrote somewhat in the essay that he was heavily criticized by the conservative wing at the time, led by Buckley. But the
To
way I
which
see it,
to which I belonged at the time.
yes, of course. Now, the way I see it, and this is, I guess, my slight defense of Kissinger or how he believed. He believed that because of America's foreign policy failures, most notably Vietnam, he believed that the America's position in the world is on the decline, and thus,
Well, sorry, I'm interrupting. As he put it, unless I'm very much mistaken, he said, "My task is to negotiate the best possible surrender terms." That's how he put it.
yes, in some ways, I can liken him to Mao's successor, Deng Xiaoping. He was a practical man, perhaps even ruthlessly so. He saw that China was devastated after Mao, and he saw that the capitalist road, as the Chinese Politburo put it, may be the road to more wealth and power. So his famous phrase is, well, "Buy the time," and also the "No matter if the cat is white or black, as long as it can catch the mouse, is fine." Um, so these are practical considerations in a time where the respective nations of each statesman, America and China, were on the decline or were perceived to be on the decline. And so you have to act accordingly to these, I suppose, prejudices that's talking about, and I guess with a less emphasis on the first principles, which in America is, I guess, anti-communism, and in China, which is Maoist communism. So how would you respond to that?
Well, I don't think that anything that starts with anti can be described as the first principle.
Mhm.
One of my favorite anecdotes from American politics involves Strom Thurmond, who was a long-serving senator from Tennessee, I believe, one of the southern states. And back in the 50s, it was very fashionable to say that Eisenhower was a communist in certain circles. And he said that at a party, and somebody objected, saying, "But you're wrong. Ike is an anti-communist." And he said, "I don't care what kind of communist he is." You know, in other words, an anti-communist and the communists are both communists, one with a plus sign, the other with a negative sign, but both use communism as their frame of reference. First principles have to be positive, and they have to be rooted in the history of Christendom. I'm talking about the West, of course. And as to the American decline in the 60s, I mean, you're right. The perception of that existed and was very expertly whipped up by certain opposing powers, specifically those two that you mentioned. But it was a fiction, of course. I mean, it's like this great missile gap that they talked about that after the launch of the first satellite by the Soviets in 1957, they were talking, "Oh, there's a huge missile gap between us and the Soviets. We're going to be bombed out of existence." Of course, that was a fiction too. I mean, the missile gap did exist, but it was in favor of the United States hugely, by a huge margin. In the early 60s, during the Kennedy years, the United States enjoyed a prohibitive military superiority over the Soviet Union. A situation, by the way, that changed in the 70s. But in the 60s, I mean, they were not even close. Economically, America was doing reasonably well. Certainly, the 50s were a very successful decade in American economics, the post-war decade. So perception, yes, that perception existed. As to China, again, Tang was a pragmatist in the same sense in which you can say that Gorbachev was a pragmatist in Russia, that they realized that doctrinaire communism was creating so much misery that the country cannot compete internationally. So they decided to modify. But what happened in China? What happened in China is that they softened up the periphery of their regime. They allowed a certain amount of free enterprise. They plugged into the world economy. They became hugely successful. But at base, it remains a communist dictatorship, which is to say, it remains evil, an evil political formation that threatens the world. And for example, Taiwan is definitely one potential flashpoint. Another one is the gradual colonization of Siberia by China. That's another interesting point. For the time being, Russia is tolerating that and even encouraging that because it's otherwise engaged. But that again creates a potential flashpoint in the world. Those pragmatic villains bother me more than ideological villains, I must say, because when the West dealt with Khrushchev or Brezhnev, everybody knew that Khrushchev was screaming, "We'll bury you," and all that, and bang his shoe on the table at the General Assembly meeting of the United Nations, and all that. And so everybody knew how the cookie crumbled. Everybody knew this is us, that's them, and there's a divide. When more pragmatic villains took over, both in Russia and China, the West allowed itself to be duped, in my view. And again, that was not, contrary to what a lot of people say, due to any kind of stupidity or any kind of ignorance. It was again a failure of character. I like intelligent people, and all my friends, without a single exception, are intelligent people because I'm bored by any other. But when it comes to statesmanship, intelligence, as I started by saying, intelligence isn't enough. If you look at the great villains of the 20th century, your Lenin, your Stalin, your Hitler, and your Mao, they were all very intelligent men, extremely intelligent, I would say. More intelligent than most of their hangers on, and so what? They were still evil. They still created untold misery. I wouldn't mention Kissinger in the same breath with those gentlemen, but if you judge the net results of his policies, then perhaps you'll agree that pragmatism isn't without its flaws as well.
Yes. A few things before I move on. Strom Thurmond was the senator, I think, of South Carolina.
Sorry, I said one Southern state. I didn't remember which.
And yeah, secondly, I would caution you against dignifying Hitler and Stalin and Mao too much by calling them gentlemen. So there's that.
It was ironic.
So I think I'm a fan and a follower of politics by first principles. And nevertheless, I see the value in Kissinger's warnings against one, if your principles are thoroughly and completely evil, like communism in the case of the Soviet Union and China, and two, if your principles are good, but it can lead to folly. I suppose the United States' foreign policy, past and present, you can name your cases. Um, so in those scenarios, both of them, a sense of pragmatism is necessary. I suppose I should mention that, as you read in the essay, most Vietnamese people like Kissinger, at least most Vietnamese people who are concerned with foreign policy. Perhaps one of the reasons is that his negotiations in Paris effectively handed the victory to the North Vietnamese over the South Vietnamese. And also Vietnam since has not been a doctrinaire communist country. There's still the Vietnamese Communist Party, there's still one party state, but I think both the party elites and the citizenry no longer believe in communism in its purest ideological form. This is anecdote that I've heard. The Prime Minister of Vietnam, Phạm Minh Chính, I believe, visited this country that I live in right now, Hungary or Budapest, and he was giving a lecture. It was translated, of course, and the English translation goes, "We believe. I know that you guys, I mean the Hungarians, stop following the road of communism, but we still move on." But I don't think he was in any way sincere about it. Nevertheless, Vietnam's compromises towards the communist doctrine save a lot of Vietnamese lives, including my own.
Well, yes, you can say that Vietnam is no longer doctrinaire communist. You can even say that China no longer is doctrinaire communist. And you can certainly say that people there no longer believe in doctrinaire communism. But I grew up in the country where nobody I knew believed in doctrinaire communism. And yet it was a communist country. And yet it threatened the world, because in communist countries, what people believe or disbelieve, is strictly of secondary importance, if any. What matters is what policy the government is pursuing, and there's no such thing as communism with a human face, as it was built back in the 60s by Czechoslovakia and places like that. Communism can wear the mask of a human face, but it has no human face, and I don't think there's any such thing as moderate communism. I think any kind of moderation on the part of communist states is merely a tactical ruse, as far as I'm concerned. But of course, I'm no expert of Vietnam compared to you. I mean, I wouldn't even dare pass judgment on Vietnam. China, I have studied a bit more than Vietnam for obvious reasons, because China is a nuclear power that can annihilate us given half the chance. So, well, it's interesting that towards the end of his life, Kissinger began to pass judgment on Putin's regime in Russia. And by and large, he sort of liked it. He he compared Putin to a Dostoevsky character out of a Dostoevsky novel, with big doubts about his own people. Putin is a gangster, fascist dictator. That's what he is. I mean, it has nothing to do with any character out of the Dostoevsky novel, including such characters as Raskolnikov, for example. I'm absolutely certain that if Kissinger were in charge of the United States foreign policy now, Kiev would already be a regional center in the Russian Federation. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind. And again, that's pragmatism. That's also the pragmatism peddled by Trump and his people when they talk about Putin's Russia. They said, look, there's a war going on. Ukrainian cities are being razed to the ground. Hundreds of thousands of people are being killed on both sides. Why don't we finish the war? I tip my hat to those people and say, chaps, you're absolutely right. War is awful. So by all means, let's finish it. But how? How do we propose we do it? And when we start talking on this uncomfortable subject, it's absolutely clear that what they mean by ending the war is Ukraine's surrender. That's exactly what they mean. And the further appeasement of a very dangerous fascist dictatorship that, by the way, has been weaned to maturity by Western infusions of capital and technology. And so that's supposed to be pragmatic as well. You know, it's interesting. The position of American neocons is very interesting in that regard, because I wrote a book about neoconservatism in which I basically was rather negative about it, putting it mildly. But the neoconservatives prove another part of my innermost convictions, that if first principles lead to folly, then perhaps there was something wrong with the first principles. Maybe they weren't that first of that right of that valid to begin with. For example, the neoconservatives agitated for the 2003 incursion into Iraq, which on general principle, I didn't have anything against. But what I objected to and still do was why they decided that was necessary. Of course, the events of 9/11 created a huge stress within the fabric of American society, and it could very easily be torn to tatters. And American people were saying we must do something. That was the collective outcry, and so I would have been in favor of a punitive raid, purely punitive raid. You select the targets that you hold responsible for that outrage, and you punish them. How you punish them is a different matter. I'm not a military expert, but it could be done with various sized bombs and missiles, and or even land invasion. But the neocons were saying that we must go into Iraq to bring democracy to the region. Bicameral parliaments, regular elections and all that. Even my son, who was a very active neocon in those days, was saying that when he saw those Iraqis walking to the voting booths, he said, I had tears in my eyes. And I wrote to him saying that so did I, but for different reasons. Because because and in this case, in the case of the Ukraine, they're also supporting. They tend to support the Ukraine, which is again because they are more democratic than Russia. In this case, I would suggest a more pragmatic approach. I would suggest that the strategic interests of the Western alliance are vested in the Ukrainian victory, and would be dramatically damaged by Russian victory. The Russians can directly threaten NATO members, as they are doing already. There are rumors that they're concentrating heavy formations on the Baltic borders, the borders of the three Baltic republics. Any incursion there would test the NATO resolve, specifically the Article 5 of the NATO Charter, saying that an attack on one member is an attack on all. Incidentally, people very often misquote that Article 5 of the NATO Charter, as I have just done, because it doesn't say in those unequivocal terms that an attack on one will automatically trigger a response from all. Because it's not what it says. It says an attack on any one member. In case of an attack on any one member, all the other members should consider a military response. That's how it's worded. Now, I may consider taking this computer that I'm sitting in front of now and tossing it out of the window. But upon mature deliberation, I may decide that that's not the right thing to do. So it's not a tripwire article that but still, a response would be needed. What would happen if Putin sends an expeditionary corps of, let's say, 50 to 100,000 men to take over the three Baltic republics, which probably would be sufficient? How would we respond? We would have only two choices. One would be to accept it, which effectively would mean disbanding NATO and saying goodbye to the post-war international order that NATO guaranteed, was a guarantor and protector of, or it would be an all-out war. But an all-out war, again, what kind of an all-out war? I would say that an immediate strategic nuclear response is not on the table at all. It wouldn't even be considered. So some kind of conventional response would be called for, but it would take NATO at least 6 months to mobilize, equip, and deploy sufficient powers to deflect a Russian incursion. For example, if you look at heavy armor, what America has in the West is not enough for that. A lot would have to be transported from the States, and that takes a very long time. And 6 months is a long time. It would be enough for the Russians to take over the Baltics, to purge them, to kill a lot of people, and then perhaps negotiate the Baltics back into NATO at the cost of tremendous concessions. So if we, however, we proceeded from the first principles that Putin's regime is evil, which it undeniably is, that he is not a character from Dostoevsky's novel. He is the character from Orwell, from 1984, and not Smith either. So if we proceed from that principle, it must be stopped, then we would get better practical results than we would by appeasement. And which is why I've written a couple of articles about Tucker Carlson's visit to Moscow, where he interviewed Putin, which I think should have been blocked. People talk about the First Amendment and the free press and all that, but free press doesn't mean providing mouthpieces for enemy propaganda, which is what Tucker Carlson would do. And time after time throughout history, it could be demonstrated that the most principled positions also turn out to be the most pragmatic ones, and vice versa. The most pragmatic ones, they tend to be amoral, and amoral they remain, but their pragmatism becomes defunct.
No, I believe that a few years ago, Tucker did come to the Hungarian capital of Budapest to talk to one Viktor Orban. That also,
Another Putinist.
yes. Um, I do know that in my home country of Vietnam, the opinions of Ukraine, there's a minority that includes me and my dad so far, as I know, who drew historical analogies with Vietnam's fight for independence against China. For example, there are thousands of years of Chinese incursions in Vietnamese soil, and Vietnam has to defend its nationhood and nationality from that imperial regime. So we see Ukraine fighting Russia as something like that. The Ukrainian people defending itself against imperial invasion, but the majority of Vietnamese who pay attention to the news think that is only Ukraine is but a battleground for Russia and the West. And I cannot help but with all the pro and anti-Ukraine, for lack of a better term, rhetoric that has been flying around in the British or sorry English language media, the concerns for Ukraine's national defense has become this like overall fight against Russia. You know, Neil Ferguson calls it Cold War II or whatever. I think I think the focus has been shifted there to more dangerous territories.
Well, if Neil Ferguson says it's Cold War II, I think he's wrong. I don't think Cold War has never ended. The first one, it's just a continuation of the other one by different means. Yes, the Ukraine is very often seen as a NATO proxy, and NATO is fighting Russia using the Ukraine as its weapon. And I suppose to a great extent that is so. But let's not forget that the active agent here is Russia. Putin made his speech in 2007 in Munich, which the Russian press refers to as the Munich speech. In which he described the collapse of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, and he committed his life and his government to undoing the catastrophe. And since then, there has been aggression against Georgia. There have been incursions into Kazakhstan. There was an attempt, even an attempted coup in Macedonia Montenegro, and so on and so forth, and an active attempt to undermine regimes in Eastern Europe, but especially in the former Soviet republics, and people who say that the West is using the Ukraine as proxy indirectly accept Kremlin's propaganda that says it was NATO that actually that is responsible, that NATO expanded eastwards, and that put Russia into an intolerable position, and there was no other way out but to attack. And I've debated against that view 1,000 times if I've done it once, and it's absolutely clear that NATO expansion to the east did not endanger Russia in any way, because people who think that it did also have to believe that some Western politicians at some point would issue orders to march on Russia in an unprovoked act of aggression. That is absolute nonsense. It's just it's impossible even to imagine that. The only thing endangered in Russia by this eastward expansion of NATO is Russia's ability to commit aggression against her neighbors. And that's what, to some extent, keeps it in check. So the active agent here is Russia and not the West. And thank goodness that Western politicians managed to cotton on to what's going on, although not immediately. Had Putin really won a quick knockout victory, as he said, within 3 days or a week or all that, uh, all NATO governments would be on board. They would say, well, it's a fait accompli, and thank you very much, but peace is important and all that. But when the conflict became protracted, that's when the Western countries started supporting the Ukraine, although in a grossly inadequate fashion, in my view. But yes, the West has a vested interest in the Ukrainian victory, but I think it's inaccurate and possibly even false to say that the West is using Ukraine. I mean, yeah, that's how the cookie crumbles in the long run, but it's not the West doing. I mean, the West had to choose sides, and of course, the Ukraine is the only side to choose. I mean, because while it is corrupt and dubiously democratic, it's still less corrupt and more democratic than Russia is. And moreover, it clearly is reaching out to the West. It wants to be plugged into the Western economies, into Western politics, and all that. Whereas Russia proceeds from the traditional Russian disdain for the West. In that case, but in that sense, Putin may be Dostoevsky character himself, because Dostoevsky hated the West too. If you read his diaries of a writer, practically every page where he's not talking about his hatred of the Jews, he talks about his hatred of the West, especially the Catholic West, but also Germany. I remember in one passage, which is a very typical sort of thing for great Russian literature, so-called. In one passage, he describes how a Russian peasant beats his wife. He ties her up, throws her on the floor, and takes a stick to her and keeps thrashing her until she stops moaning and moving. And he said, what's the next sentence? The next sentence is, this man is a savage, a brute. He should be put away with the key thrown away forever, right? But Dostoevsky's next sentence is, nevertheless, this same peasant is superior in every spiritual way to the German Vater who saves money all his life to provide for his family. Now, the gustibus and all that, I mean, the tastes differ, but I think that this tendency to save money and provide for your family is still preferable to beating your wife to a bloody pulp. But that is a traditional Russian attitude to the West, cultivated both by the imperial governments, but also by the communist government, and now by Putin's government. I mean, it's almost an existential condition, not to say ontological condition of the Russian nation. Whereas the Ukraine, by the way, has never been like that. The Ukraine has always been more Western. For example, if you look at agriculture, the Ukraine has always had farmers in the Western sense of the world. They had their own hamlets, and they had an extended family working the fields and all that, and it was all very individualistic. and very, to use a Marxist term, capitalistic, if you will. Whereas in Russia, agriculture, even under the Tsars, was in the hands of peasant communes that were taxed collectively, that produced collectively, suffered collectively, starved collectively, and all that. The Ukrainians have always been thrifty and more Western in that sense than the Russians. They were also more freedom loving than the Russians. You know, people don't ignore the fact, but the Ukrainian guerrillas continued fighting the Soviets into the mid-50s for at least 10 years after the war ended. They went into the forests and were launching raids against the Soviets from there. So yes, the proxy of the West as it has worked out, but not as it was started, not as it was meant to be.
So I'd like to end on a final question, that being, what did Kissinger learn from the Congress of Vienna? And I wonder your views on whether your views on that particular event lines up with him, or are there any deviations of note?
Well, what Kissinger might have learned from the Congress of Vienna was that it was possible to create a world order that would last a century. You know, all it took was, you know, first it took an extremely sanguinary war and prolonged war, but then it was possible for great statesmen to sit down and thresh out some kind of compact that proved to be rather durable, unlike many other compacts of that kind. You know, for example, look at the Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939. It only lasted for less than 2 years, you know, and yet it was on the face of it, it was something with a bright future for the two evil regimes. They basically divided Europe between them, and you would think that that's a natural alliance. And so it was at the beginning of the war, which they started as ally, and then they fell apart. Whereas, of course, your Metternich, your Talleyrand, and all those people, they, while being extremely amoral men, some of them, such as Talleyrand, for example, they found a way to accommodation. You know, but that is but that is in general terms. But such things are never general. They're always concrete. And obviously, the situation Kissinger found himself in was entirely different, because for one thing, Napoleonic France, while it had its fans and also its detractors, still, it's difficult to argue that it was a huge evil force, you know, and it was a misguided force, and Napoleon himself was a hugely controversial figure, combining characteristics of a genius and a villain. But Kissinger found himself in a different situation, where in a situation of global confrontation. And his assessment of the situation had to be influenced by it, and I think his assessment was wrong. His assessment was, like I say, he wanted to negotiate the best terms of surrender, whereas he should have negotiated the best terms of victory. As by the way, the powers at the Vienna Congress did with France. They they found a very gentle sort of accommodation with France. They made it possible uh, for France to thrive within the next century or so. You know, they turned France into a decent country. Kissinger's accommodation with Russia and China did not turn them into decent countries. It just smoothed their way to global power, I think. And in that sense, I think the net result of his activities was hugely negative. But I can understand how different views are possible. I haven't read Ferguson's book on Kissinger, mainly because I don't find other things I've read by Ferguson particularly interesting. But it's maybe I should.
I would recommend it. Yes.
It's I'm always on my guard against historians who write popular books, like our own Andrew Roberts, who's a wonderful man, by the way, and I think I've even met him, and Ferguson as well. I think it's they kind of separate history from philosophy. For obvious reasons, because history can very easily be presented as a compendium of entertaining anecdotes, whereas philosophy is boring. I mean, you have to talk about very deep things, really, before philosophy starts making any sense at all. However, when history, and therefore politics, is divorced from philosophy, it can't really succeed. I mean, it's uh, because mankind needs discipline. I mean, the greatest creativity can only be expressed within a very rigid discipline. I mean, look at music, for example. You take the most musically gifted virtuoso, and if he violates the basic discipline of his craft, he'll create a cacophony, not a recognizable work of music. So philosophy gives shape to any kind of coherent understanding of history, and only philosophy can do that. You know, but people like Ferguson, Eaton, Roberts, and a few others, I could Simon Seebeck, Montefiore was also our chap. They don't have solid philosophical grounding, I think, which makes their books very entertaining. And those that I've read, I can testify to their entertaining quality. I was suitably entertained. But in terms of being enlightening, I think they should be taken with a grain of salt, and ideally also a shot of tequila. You know, it's and that's the difference between them, for example, and somebody like Mester, Joseph de Mester. He also made frequent excursions into history, but he proceeded from a very solid philosophical foundation, like which made his theories of history extremely coherent and intelligible. They added up on their own terms. You may reject his terms and therefore reject his theories, but you can't say that they just don't add up because they do. Whereas when you talk about modern historians, or rather historians of modernity, most of them are all over the place because they react rather to events without going one step further in trying to and digging 1 foot deeper in trying to understand the origin of things, the origin of history, the origin of man, for that matter, the nature of man. And the moment you ignore those things, you enter the genre of literature, but leave the genre of scholastic discipline, of science. And history is a science. You know, people forget about it, but it is a science. But for it to function as science, it has to be linked to philosophy. In that sense, I agree with Marx. You know, the problem with Marx was that his philosophy was false and generally cannibalistic. But the overall idea that history is an aspect of philosophy was correct. But but critical there is a little adjective, correct. History should be a genre of correct philosophy, not false philosophy.
Well, I should say that we'll be doing an episode on Joseph de Maistre soon. So
Oh, I would love to. I would love to take part in that because he was one of my formative influences. Let's put it this way. In some ways, more than Burke, even because de Maistre was more demonstrative of his Christianity than Burke was. Burke also said that the state is willed by God, and de Maistre was also a better writer. I mean, Burke was a fantastic writer, of course, and he has given us many brilliant aphorisms. But by and large, if you read his reflections, it's quite heavy going. I mean, whereas de Maistre's books read like detective novels. You know, you just breeze through them, and then you realize that you just read something very deep. But some of his aphorisms, by the way, have gained general currency. But people don't know their provenance. For example, everybody says every nation gets the kind of government it deserves. Everybody has heard that, but not everybody knows it was de Maistre who said that. And he said that specifically in Russia, where he lived for 14 years as ambassador of the Sardinian king to the court of Alexander I. And he was an extremely influential figure to Russian thought of the 19th century, specifically Tolstoy. If you read his War and Peace, there are long asides on history, and there he borrowed whole pages of de Maistre's works without attribution, of course. And de Maistre even makes an appearance as a minor character in War and Peace. Eventually, by the way, he was expelled from Russia because under his influence, Petersburg aristocracy began to convert to Catholicism, and that could not be allowed. So he was sent back to Turin, where he had to live now. Then, but again, there are things I disagree with in de Maistre's work, but I can't think of a single thinker I can accept the root and branch. I mean, one should always look when reading great men. One should always look for things you consider good, and de Maistre offers lots of them. For example, he believed in a sort of theocracy, which I have problems with. I think that that government should be informed by Christianity, but not directly influenced by it, not directly steered by it. he believed that the Pope should have temporal power, which I emphatically disagree with, and so on and so forth. There are all kinds of things that one can disagree with the master, but he understood the nature of constitution, the master, as did Burke, basically rebelled against the whole philosophy of the 18th century. And specifically, he was scathing about the theory of social contract, which started with, well, it started a very long time ago, but the most immediate influences were Locke, John Locke, and through him Rousseau, of course, who wrote his Du Contrat Social, and he said that. Well, I always write about it. Only recently I wrote an article said I've never signed a social contract, but he rejected the possibility that people could actually sit down together and create a commonwealth and create government. He said, for them to do that, he said, government already had to exist. All those arrangements were made to secure certain rights, but for them to wish to secure, and obviously the need to secure those rights arose because those rights were perceived to be under threat. But for them to be under threat, they already had to exist. So the basic understanding of how governments develop and how they appear really has little to do with any kind of social contract. When de Maistre was debating the Salic law is inheritance through the male line, basically. His opponents say, well, where the hell is this law written? And he said, well, this law is written in the hearts of Frenchmen, meaning that any kind of constitutional arrangement has to be organic. It has to be written in people's hearts. And if it is, then a written document is superfluous. And if it isn't, then a written document is useless. De Maistre said outright, he said, any written constitution is worthless. And he wrote the word worthless in capitals, in all caps, it's worthless. He was an extremely influential thinker, specifically on constitutional matters. And he didn't talk much about the United States because although the United States obviously already existed in his time, but it wasn't, he probably didn't regard it as a serious player. But with Burke, it's also, if you want to do those, I suggest you treat Burke and Master together because they play against each other very well. They agree in most of their premises and some of their ideas, but they also disagree. And it's very interesting to show where they disagree and where they agree. Because de Maistre, speaking about the divine right, he said that if you look at constitutions, then they're all passed down from high to low. I mean, very clever people get together, they write them, and the populace has to follow. But if you talk about those clever people, and if you talk about the people who actually do the governing, I mean, specifically monarchs and all that, then you can't really see where they started and who begat them. And they say they go back and disappear into the haze of time, so distant that you might as well believe that the power comes from God. That's how he put it. He didn't say all power comes from God, although he did say that as well. But this wording is very precise. He just said for all practical purposes, basically, he said power comes from God. Because you can't trace its source back to any other starting point. So he was a very deep political thinker, but at the same time, a dazzling writer. He was a brilliant writer of French, who contributed more to the French language than Burke did to the English language. Let's put it this way, although Burke used it extremely well. But well, you mentioned Buckley. Well, Buckley was informed by those two thinkers tremendously, which is why by the way, he and Kissinger were personal friends.
Yeah.
They very close friends, as a matter of fact. But Buckley didn't care for Kissinger's policies, specifically in reference to Russia and China. And Buckley has been proved right, in my view, and Kissinger has been proved wrong, which again, hail to the first principles. Let's live our lives under that slogan.
Right. I think that's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you very much, Alexander Booth, for gracing us with your presence.
Well, thank you very much for having me.